Everybody in. So good afternoon again. You're all very welcome to this webinar on public transport fares with ourselves from the ITF and also with UITP based on recent work. My name is Orla McCarthy. I'm the co-head of research here at the ITF with responsibility for our country-led programme of work. And I'm going to just give a very brief overview of recent work that led to this point of discussing fares before I hand over to our two lead experts on the topic. So, and straight away, the slides stop working. There we go. So there's already a great scope to reduce carbon emissions and improve sustainable accessibility, particularly in urban settings, but especially outside the urban core. And as urban travel demand grows into the future, modal shift will become even more necessary to manage sustainable development. And of course, public transport is going to be a core part of this shift. Provisional results from the forthcoming ITF Transport Outlook 2025 suggest that public transport trips will grow by over 50% by 2060, even just under a business as usual scenario. And this increase will be 68% under a more ambitious decarbonisation scenario. So public transport will have a lot of work to do, because it will form a critical part of the solution for decarbonisation and also for supporting accessibility. But to do this, public transport needs to be attractive to users. It needs to be safe and reliable, comfortable, and offer a viable alternative to personal cars. And this will require a well-integrated multimodal transport system with public transport as its backbone. Achieving this will require investment. Earlier this year, ITF published a report from one of our working groups which looked at sustainable ways of funding public transport into the future. It identified that sustainable public transport requires optimizing funding from three key sources: government budgets and earmarked taxes, taxes on indirect beneficiaries of accessibility improvements, and user fares. So looking more closely at the fares question, fare revenue as a proportion of operating costs are declining in most countries, and this necessitates fare policy reforms that maintain equitable access. Fare reform can be politically sensitive, so in optimizing user fares, authorities should publish their fare policies based on explicit principles, establish formal fare setting processes rather than ad hoc changes, and reform fare structures to create efficient incentives, for example, differentiating fares between peak and off-peak. Finally, authorities should adopt well-targeted concession policies, because better targeted concession fares can be more equitable, meaning that subsidies are given to those who need them most. And this was the starting point for our next project, Fares Fair, which was funded as part of ITF's Innovation Hub. This report looks at fare policy and affordability from the perspective of how it impacts users and accessibility. At the same time, UITP have been working on a policy brief on affordable fares from the perspective of operators and authorities. Now, I should note these two projects were conducted independently, but they provide complementary perspectives on a core issue facing all actors in the public transport system, as they try to balance the books, keep an attractive level of service, or just get where they need to go. And that is why we are delighted to have Angela Koo, Director of Policy and Regulation at Singapore's Public Transport Council, and co-chair of UITP's Transport Economics and Finance Committee, here with us today to present UITP's latest policy brief on the topic, Keeping It Fair. We'll also be joined by my own colleague, Josephine Macharia, the project lead for the Fares Fair report, and one of our leading policy analysts working on accessibility for all, who will present Fares Fair. I'll hand over to Angela first, then we'll hear from Josephine, but then we have allowed time for questions and answers at the end. So I would encourage you, please, to use that Q&A function in the menu, most likely at the bottom of your screen. And please submit your questions for our panelists as they're presenting, and there will be some time afterwards as well. And with that, Angela, you are very welcome. Thank you for taking the time to join us for today's webinar. And I will hand over to you for your presentation.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thanks for having me. Thank you, Ola, for the kind introduction and a very nice opening to set the context for today's webinar. It is an honor to be here with Helia and fellow colleagues from the wider public transport ecosystem. So on behalf of the UITP Transport Economics and Finance Committee, as well as the Fare Affordability Working Group, I will be sharing some of the insights from our knowledge brief on fare affordability. I think I don't have the control for the slides yet. I'm sorry, excuse me. Yep, okay, maybe there's some lag in that. Okay. Yes. So first, introduction of UITP. So UITP's members are public transport authority and operators, policy decision makers, research institutes, and the public transport supply and service industry. So for me personally, it's been enriching to be part of UITP Transport Economics and Finance Committee, which is such a awesome platforms to exchange views with different stakeholders, especially views from the private and operator side of the house. As for me, coming from the authority side, it's kind of good to see from different perspective. And the brief is also about that, presenting a snapshot on current reflection of fare affordability from different side of the house. Okay, yeah. So a very quick introduction of the policy brief on fare affordability. It is actually one of the continuation of UITP 2020 policy brief on free fares, but we all know public transport service is not free. When we make it free, the fare box revenue foregone would have to come from other sources, whether taxpayer, government compensation, third-party funding, or additional commercial revenue. So it was first considered as a topic of interest during the Brazil and Chile's 2019 riots due to an increase in bus fare. So the idea started from there. I think when we started this journey a few years back to look at fare affordability, I didn't anticipate the level of interest would have been so high for this topic. But in the last few years, there seems to be willingness to use fare policies to achieve broader policy objectives, such as to address rising costs, living costs, to address inflation concerns. So depending on the public policy objective of the cities, the profile of the public transport users, different fare products can be introduced to retain regular users, attract occasional users, and as well as new users to the system. So at UITP, we look at the affordability from different angles, not just from the perspective of passenger, but also from the operators, funding authority, as well as also explore new approaches to implement affordable fare schemes. So that sort of is an overview snapshot. So for my presentation, I'll give you an overview of the concept of affordability, how this concept is then applied to passenger, the company, as well as the regulating entity, as well as some of the potential avenues for actions highlighted through 6 key recommendations in our policy brief. Okay. Now, on deploying fare affordability, some of the main challenges highlighted in the brief include shining a light on the need to level the playing field between private and public transport by giving public transport priority and incentive. So although the real cost of owning and using private car is significantly higher than the cost of annual public transport pass, the comparison shifts when you look at the marginal cost of using and owning a private car for additional trip versus the cost of taking a single trip, especially if the single trip is high for occasional public transport user. And we need to think about how to level the playing field in this area. The next challenge is how to keep the balance or keep an equilibrium between different fare products and schemes, targeted scheme for different segments. So how do you make it ensure that it's equitable or it's fair? The third challenge is how to ensure financial sustainability of the public transport network. manage the funding and revenue shortfall when you deploy affordable fare schemes? What are the sources of income that can be used to support operational expenses, including compensating or covering for the revenue shortfall of pricing fare level below the actual cost, including cost of pricing levels, such as when you offer concessions fare product. So why should public transport fare be affordable? I think the purpose and value generated from public transport has social, economic, and environmental benefits. We are all from the public transport sectors. I would not expand too much on that, but just to share some of the content from the knowledge brief, the 2024 UITP survey provided some insights on household mobility budgets. Households spend about 5 to 15% of income in transportation expenditure. The questions that authority operators, decision makers should ask is, how do we know if the fares are affordable or not in your cities? There is a role for affordability indexes and data to estimate the affordability of public transport services and to inform fare decisions. The brief shared the different indexes that can be used to evaluate the state of fare affordability in your respective jurisdiction, thereby providing insights and comparison on the burden of mobility costs on individuals or households, as well as individuals and households from different income quintiles or deciles. With this data, you can then make decisions and design better products to attract people to the public transport systems. So we have some examples in the brief on how you can do it, whether it's focusing on income level, whether it's looking at fixed distance cost per km, fare per passenger kilometers, or minutes work required for someone to be able to afford fare tickets. So there are some examples in there, and I do strongly encourage you to look into that. So the view from the committee is that only with these insights and data can you then better address the social needs of your customer or of the passenger. And we should monitor the changes and evolution over time so that we know whether affordability is getting better or worsening. Observe strategies to deploy affordable fares, optimizing subsidies and ridership. The brief covers main trends in fare of policies and its development. We also look at what are some of the key strategies. So in our brief, 3 main strategies have been identified as path to deploy affordable fares. So you have fare-based strategies. This strategy focuses on the volumes by creating enticing products such as monthly, annual, climate passes. In a sector where price of public transport or fare is generally affordable or low compared to other options, the use of price volume strategies, basically you play with price elasticities of different segments of the population, but it can be quite tricky to get it right because you can build very attractive fare product that focusing on increasing ridership, but to create a steady stream of revenue that covers the cost, sometimes the price may not cover the cost fully. And that's when you need to look into how to then deal with the shortfall in revenue when you design fare-based products. The next strategy is fee-based strategies and solidarity fares. This includes basically, you include a larger group of potential users into fare product by means of regulatory or contractual provisions. Some of the examples we have in the brief includes tourism or touristic regions such as places like Sweden, Austria, German cities. They tend to earmark a proportion of the public transport into their local tourist levy. And in return, they are entitled to the free use of public transport, but the costs have already been priced in through the levy and it can be funded through this. Oftentimes, what we observe is that the revenue usually exceeds the previous fare revenue from the same group of potential users. So quite attractive strategies for some of these cities, especially if you have lots of tourists visiting the cities. The other example we have in the brief is solidarity fares. We noticed that many universities in Germany, for example, have agreed with their students' union on a semester pass available to make semester pass available for all students in the area surrounding their campus. So these passes are substantially rebated compared to other products, and then students can use it. The other example could be employers or landlord using similar model to fund the fare products and tickets. The tickets may be either part of the wages or included in the rent, for example. The other examples we have include voluntary solutions, whether you offer a rebate fare level to the employees or tenant if they take public transport. In Singapore, we have built a system where there's health points to be redeemed through e-vouchers. So if people exercise more, and this is funded by actually a non-transport agency. So they were basically promoting public health or health promotion, but then whatever they have done there, they can accumulate points and in exchange use it to top up their public transport travel card. So these are some of the voluntary options we have in the brief. The third strategies, I think it's quite common in most of the cities, which are the income-based fare scheme. Basically, these kind of fare products are designed based on income, on the household situation, whether it's concession tickets for lower wage worker or lower income households. I believe it's quite common in different cities, and we have reflected this in the knowledge brief, but I will not elaborate too much on that given the time constraint we have here. Next. Now, I've spoken about the different fare product. We wanted to look at also the impact on operator. It is very important for a sustainable public transport network for us to balance fare affordability, as well as acknowledge and recognize the cost pressure faced by the operator and provide revenue source certainty. Without addressing some of these issues, the operators or the authorities will not be able to invest in the longer term development as well as maintenance of the public transport system. So as mentioned earlier, discounted or free fare is not free. Someone has to pay for it. From UITP survey, the trend towards affordable fare scheme has been growing stable, with over 25% of survey responding to their budget for concessionary fares had either increased 2 to 5% or significantly increased 6 to 10%. So compensation to operator is a key element to ensure financial sustainability of the network, especially in the context of increasing fuel prices, manpower costs, so on and so forth. So around 60% survey included the level of compensation on a year-on-year basis via their budgets, closely followed by negotiated grants with their local politician or competent entities, with some using formulas agreed between operators and competent authorities to deal with the revenue shortfall. Now, I wanted to touch on this, which is quite common in Asian cities. So in the brief, we also touch on the use of fare formula. The committee's view is that it can be a suitable tool both for benchmarking the evolution of costs and fares, as well as a communication instrument between transport authority and citizen. It considered the key cost driver in providing public transport services. Its use can provide a yardstick upon which to measure and support the negotiation, effectively allowing authorities to communicate with either the passenger, the citizen, or the operators that is providing the services. Yeah. Now I think okay. I think every city is different. Every public transport network is different. We have to look at the context. But despite these differences, from our kind of sharing and exchanges within the committee and with other members of the UITP, there are nevertheless commonality across different cities that can be shared and should be looked into, and we recommend these key 6 areas for consideration. First, an adequate level of public transport supply and affordable fare require both public funding besides the fare revenue. There should be a public contribution to the cost of public transport in addition to the revenue from fares paid by the direct user, the passenger. The public contribution is justified by the general benefit of public transport that contribute positively to the whole society. This includes non-user as well. The way we like to say it in Singapore is it is a shared responsibility for both the user, the government, as well as the non-user as well. And operator play their part in making sure they offer a high quality, reliable, and safe system for the users. The fare paid by passenger of public transport should be affordable for all groups of the population and be competitive to the marginal cost of cars. Therefore, it is important for the local authorities to keep track on passenger costs, know how much they're spending on it, their mobility expenditure of different population group, and then develop targeted assistance or fare product that caters to their need. Next, social or concessionary fare products to cater to different needs are best adapted to allow affordable fares for the most vulnerable population while maintaining a reasonable overall contribution from fares to the total cost of public transport. We all know that resources are constrained. So the question is how best to then use our limited resources and where should we provide more help and where we should invest in when we develop our public transport network. Fourth, the deployment of social tariffs should be done in a targeted and limited way to avoid the erosion of the fare base and its economic pressure on the service level of the system. So I think ITF have also mentioned in their report, fare affordability or cheaper fare itself is not the key or the only thing that matters. Quality matters as well. Coverage of the public transport network matters as well. What we observe in our preparation of the brief is also a fare formula linked to service offer, inflation, and affordability might help to set the right fare level over time and to objectivize the debate on the opportunity of fare increases. Now, the last point and recommendation from the UITP knowledge brief is this. Affordable fares of public transport should be combined with improvement of service quality in order to create a conducive ecosystem to attract and retain more public transport users to the system, thereby creating a positive feedback loop. I've come to close to the end of my presentation. The brief of fare affordability is currently being published and will be available shortly. So if you're interested, please sign up through the QR code or email Helia directly. And I think I'll pass the presentation and the slides back to Ola, or will Josephine take over?
Thank you very much.
Sorry, Josephine, you can go ahead. Thank you very much, Angela.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Angela, for this. I will now begin talking about the Fares Fare Report once I can get the screen moving. Just give me a moment. There we go. Thank you. So I'll build on that to focus a little bit more now on the considerations for policymakers looking to develop fare policies that can improve access to opportunity, increase public transport use, all while optimizing the user contributions and contributing to other wider objectives of public transport. This report from the Mobility Innovation Hub builds on the funding public transport work mentioned by my colleague Orla, and that report found that declining fare revenues really create a need for fare policy reforms that can address this challenge in general. However, it's worth noting, as has already been mentioned, that maximizing revenues is not the only purpose for fare policies. Public transport provides access to opportunities, but it's not enough for the mode to be available to just exist. If fares present a barrier in terms of cost, then access to opportunities using public transport becomes limited. Through various case studies, this report explores how fare policies can play a role in reducing the cost and technology barriers that can limit access to public transport, keeping in mind the cost pressures and uncertainties around revenues for public transport systems that have been discussed by Angela already. All right, let me see if I can get to the next slide. So access to opportunity using public transport is influenced by the network design and service availability mostly, and also by factors that go beyond transport. So individual characteristics, mobility needs, even where people live. But fare policies, including fare structures and fare prices, also play a role in influencing how people access the mode. Different fare structures influence usage and are in fact often targeting different types of usage patterns. For example, pay-as-you-go fares, so single tickets, are mainly targeting occasional users, which has already been mentioned. So they might not provide significant flexibility, but their upfront costs are then also lower, making it easy for people to take public transport occasionally. On the other hand, for authorities, these fares actually present an opportunity for better pricing models that can capture the marginal costs of additional usage, particularly in contexts where other road use pricing measures are already in place to better capture the external costs of travel. Other fare products, such as subscription passes, usually target the needs of frequent users because for a higher upfront cost, they allow unlimited travel. For people making frequent trips, unlimited subscriptions would be more attractive because they provide more flexibility. But then thinking about people that might have lower incomes, the high upfront costs of subscription passes can actually mean that their funds are tied up well in advance of their actual travel, which means they may end up still opting for single tickets, even when they're not the most cost-effective option. And for public authorities, such passes might actually result in higher consumption, potentially overcrowding, which can impact the perception and attractiveness of public transport systems. So authorities are then obligated to find ways to balance the needs of frequent users and occasional users while meeting their funding needs. One way authorities have done this is through fare capping policies. So they get rid of subscription passes altogether, but introduce a cap after which users no longer pay for additional trips. This can reduce the upfront cost barrier for users because they're charged a lower per trip fare. And if they're frequent users, then they still have the flexibility of nearly unlimited travel. This can also allow public transport authorities to balance the potential efficiency gain of a pay-as-you-go fare with the need to ensure access for frequent users. And of course, this has been mentioned by Angela, beyond the fare structure, authorities need to consider actual fare setting such that they improve affordability, but also take into account the wider context of pricing measures for the transport system. That is, if fares are priced too low to make public transport more attractive, then it also reduces the necessary revenue for improving the public transport system and can actually worsen service quality for people that rely on the mode. So how fares are set can be an opportunity to influence how the public transport system is used and to meet other objectives in an often resource-constrained environment. For example, fares can be differentiated by time of day to help address capacity issues, smooth out demands and peak demands, or by mode and by distance to account for the distributional effects of service consumption. So people taking shorter trips are then not subsidizing people taking longer trips and various other reasons like that. So because fares are a sensitive topic, we propose that authorities should base fare policies on explicit principles, making sure that they are integrated into overall transport policy, such that the links between policies and the strategic role of public transport is clear. The fares report outlines the following principles for fare setting. First, transparency. So authorities should support fare decisions with regular evaluations, ideally independently conducted and well communicated to the public. Second, they should prioritize inclusiveness, especially when it comes to ticketing technologies, which provide a lot of data for decision making, but can also exclude some users. Third, they should consider flexibility and integration, keeping in mind how land use and transport interact to limit or improve access to opportunities. And fourth, they should make sure that fares are affordable by adopting well-targeted concession policies and simplifying access to subsidies for eligible individuals. With that in mind, the fares report presents the following recommendations illustrated through the case studies. First, support fair decision-making with regular evaluation, which I've already mentioned. It should be independently assessed to make sure that objectives are achieved and can include mechanisms for fair adjustments, as has been illustrated in the Singapore context. And these evaluations should also be clearly communicated to the public and stakeholder, which can improve transparency in the decision-making process. For public transport authorities, it's especially important to evaluate where other policies might limit the effectiveness of their fare policies. So maybe free parking policies or poor transfer facilities. And that also leads to the next recommendation, which is to jointly optimize fare pricing and road user charging. This is particularly important for systems that rely on fare revenues for a large share of their operating costs. It's important if the negative externalities of private car use are not sufficiently accounted for, because then you price fares really low to attract people from cars, but that's not enough to sustain the system. Instead, fare prices should be set with consideration for service quality and to avoid underfunding systems. Additionally, better pricing models in terms of marginal costs, as has been mentioned, can lead to more efficient use of transport resources, as noted in the example of differentiated fares to smooth peak demand. Next, when thinking about reducing the cost barrier, it's important to note that many studies find that fare elasticity, or the sensitivity to public transport prices, is asymmetric. So increasing fares can decrease ridership, but decreasing fares doesn't necessarily increase ridership. This can mean that blanket fare reductions impact revenues at the cost of service quality and reliability. The report recommends instead you better target concessions, focusing on lowering costs for the people that need it the most, and considering also different intersecting identities, for example, age and income instead of just age, which influences access. For example, if you have discounted fares just for older adults, then you might be excluding low-income adults who might also benefit from that discount. Similarly, certain policies related to how people access concessions can present additional barriers, and extensive means testing for users who need subsidized fares can actually deter them from accessing these fares, and it creates an additional administrative burden for authorities. In the report, the Bogota case study and the LA Metro case study provide examples of different approaches to targeting concessions for those that most need it, including direct subsidy delivery schemes, which have been demonstrated to actually enhance accessibility and mobility and reduce social exclusion. And this actually has greater impacts on low-income individuals and also has gendered implications, which are worth thinking about. Building on that point on reducing social exclusion and also unlocking some latent demand for mobility, fare policies can also be a way to boost the flexibility of existing services. That is, policies such as transfer windows for single ticket fares or reciprocal fares for services that overlap or cross boundaries in metropolitan areas can create more flexible travel options for users, such as facilitating the trip chains that are needed to support care-related activities. But importantly, fare policies cannot compensate for inadequate service levels or address physical barriers to access. That is, there's only so much a fare policy can do when there are barriers such as poor transfer facilities. In the Jakarta case study, for example, we look at how there are generous transfer windows which allow for people to connect between the different modes. But in some instances, the transfer distance can be so excessive that it creates an actual additional barrier for people with disabilities or people traveling with goods. So fare policies then need to take into consideration what the reality is of the operating context to better make sure that they are actually being effective in meeting their objectives. Where public transport service is sufficient, where there's a good amount of service available, and policymakers are actually interested in shifting people then from private car travel to sustainable modes, fare policies can be an opportunity to influence attitudes towards public transport and disrupt habitual travel choices. This is illustrated through various offers, such as the Austria Klima Ticket and the Seoul Climate Card, both of which are discussed in the report. It's important that such offers have the potential which have the potential to to increase demand, are provided within the context of sufficient supply. So they need to be supported by a commitment from public authorities to provide the funding stability needed to maintain service levels. If public transport can be the core of a well-integrated multimodal transport system, then easy to understand fare payment options, integrated fares between modes will play a role in reducing any barriers to multimodality. And importantly, this is just part of the puzzle, one part of the puzzle. It should be considered as part of a wider package of measures to address car use in general and improve mobility. Finally, data needs, transparency, and inclusion principles should guide the choice of ticketing technologies, because selecting ticketing technologies and fare collection norms should be done with consideration for reducing barriers to access. Technology for its own sake can perpetuate inequalities, whether it's by excluding people because of a digital divide or by creating unnecessary complexity for users. In the LA Metro example, there's a significant public awareness campaign that was undertaken to help make sure that the shift to a smart card does not exclude many of their transport users who are actually paying by cash. But beyond payment methods, public transport authorities also need to consider how the wealth of data that's provided by these fare payment systems is used to evaluate service delivery, and if in doing so, some users are being excluded. For example, if a large share of users has no access to smart cards or mobile payment apps, and this data is used to make service delivery decisions, then it might not be actually representing the people who are using the system. If authorities select technologies and fare collection methods that prioritize ease of access, then they really have to also give consideration for a combination of qualitative and quantitative data methods to make sure that they have a full picture of the service that they're providing. And with that, I will wrap it up. You can find our report online here, and I'll pass it on to Orla for the discussion.
Thank you very much, Josephine. I will stop you controlling my screen if that's okay. All right, and I will there are the links for more information on both reports, on the Fares Fair report and the forthcoming policy brief from UITP as well. And perhaps, I don't know, Angela or Hilia, what's the timeline on that, on the publication?
Hi, so as soon as our graphic designer gives it back to us, so hopefully, in the coming weeks, so by January, just to make sure that we forego the Christmas holidays, but
super, thank you very much. A great start to the new year for everyone. Some great reading to get their teeth into to get things going in January. So thank you everybody for the presentations. Now it is the opportunity of our attendees and participants to raise their questions. I see a few questions coming in. I did see a few come in during the presentations around kind of transferability of policies and localization. So Angela, maybe I could start with you with a question on, are the use of fare formulas easily adaptable or replicable across different types of networks and stakeholders? Or is this something very, very localized?
No, I think it is easily adaptable for different, in fact, for different transport mode as well. So for example, in Singapore, the formula that we have uses both the cost structure of bus and train services. But I think in other jurisdictions or city, if you just want to set a fare for just the train fare or the bus fare, you can then look at just the cost structure of the bus industry or the train industry, because there is slight difference in that. And then again, you can look at the cost structure of whether they are running on diesel buses or actually they are electric buses. The cost would be slightly different, whether they are using AV autonomous buses or they're using two shift or whether two drivers and things like that. You can adapt it for different cities. I think there's some flexibility in that. And I guess the authority can also decide whether do I just want to, for a start, look at just inflation and not the other costs as well? Or do you want to include consideration into manpower costs because you want to kind of address the issue about cost increase or salary increase for the public transport worker? So there's some flexibility in that. So I think it is quite easily adaptable, and whoever that is interested could email us. We are happy to share. There are different models for Singapore, Hong Kong, I believe, Taiwan or some other cities. They are using a formula, maybe not publicly, but within their contract as well. So yeah.
Super. Thank you very much, Angela. So if I think there were, I spotted 2 questions anyway on this kind of question on local applicability. So if you'd like to email us directly, we will put email addresses up at the end. You will receive an email after this event closes as well. So please feel free to follow up. And I think, Angela, as far as I can recall, the policy brief itself also includes some breakdown of types of fare formula. So I think further reading there as well for anybody who's interested. So we've spoken a lot, obviously, about the pros, the value, the role that fare policy can play. Josephine, maybe I could just come back to, we touched on it, Angela touched on it as well, lightly about the question of, free fares policy and things like that, and the asymmetric, you mentioned the asymmetric attractiveness of changing fares. What are the limitations of fare policy if we're being realistic about it?
Right. I think this is a good question because we can't think of fare policies as what will address, say, inadequate service levels. For example, you can give people very generous transfer windows, but if their trips take much longer because the services are not well coordinated, because the transfers are not available to them, then really you're not addressing the core issue. And this kind of comes back to the question of making sure that public transport systems are well funded. Because if there's not enough funding in the public transport system to make sure that the service being provided is meeting the needs of users, then you can't really address that gap in service delivery, service provision with a fare strategy that's a little bit more generous. So thinking of fare policies as a way to not only help address the challenge of revenue uncertainties, but also as an opportunity to get the best out of your system is what we propose we should consider for fare policies, but also just understanding that there's that limitation in terms of some physical barriers that still exist that you need to address, or some challenges in actually funding adequate service levels is really important.
Great, thank you very much, Josephine. So I'm just looking through the questions that have come through here. There are some, they're quite specific, unsurprisingly. Everybody asks questions based on their own context that they work and live in. So I'm going to maybe sort of to give sort of a generalized version of some of the questions. So we have a question here on mandated employer programs to support fares for employees. So this is around I guess they give example of France and Brazil they ask about. So in France it would be the versement mobilité, I suppose, that they're referring to. So Angela, I see you're nodding. Josephine, I know we also did some work on this in the funding public transport working groups. So Angela, if I could come to you first, perhaps, and then we'll go to Josephine as well.
Okay, can you point me to the question regarding
it's right down
my view, about my opinion on mandating employee program to support fares for employees? It seems to be from our exchanges with the France and Brazil authorities and operators, seems to be working. But I think just looking at the perspective of different people, including the employers, I think it brings back the point of what Josephine have highlighted as well. It's important to engage the stakeholders that are affected by your fare policies. I think depending how it's implemented, it could affect the employer's decision in terms of hiring or of the benefits that they offer to the workers and stuff like that. So I think for France, it's slightly different because they do have quite a long history of, I think, having this program. To introduce it right now, I think there needs to be some sort of stakeholder engagement to make sure there's consensus and buy-in from the employees. So I think that's my comment. We don't have it in Singapore yet, but it is one of the strategies, and it's quite interesting, but I would emphasize stakeholder engagement. Thank you.
Super. Thank you so much, Angela. And Josephine, do you have maybe a follow-on to that?
Again, I would just maybe point at the example that Angela raised on, I think it was a tourist cities that use this sort of levy to create a sustainable funding stream for public transport. I think that these types of programs can be an opportunity to create a sustainable funding stream, and it also attracts people to the public transport system. So there is an opportunity there to make sure that, you know, your revenue stays sustainable by already having such programs in place.
Great, thank you very much. And Josephine, I'll come back to you because you did raise the point of technologies and obviously the need for them to operate within the prevailing regulatory context as well. And we have a question here on interoperability and data protection, data privacy issues in the technologies that are used. Would you maybe could you maybe expand a little bit on the technology aspect of this work, please?
Right. So again, I think it's what we say in the report, that it's really important to make sure that technology isn't just chosen because it's technology, right? You have to think about the needs of the system, the context, the operating context. So in the example of the LA Metro, for example, they have, I think, over 40% of their users are actually paying cash fares. So if you introduce a smart card system and all the benefits of using public transport, so the fare capping can only be accessed through the smart card system, then there are some people that will be naturally excluded. So thinking about who exactly this technology is serving and what kind of additional policies and considerations can be made to bridge that gap is very necessary. And then, of course, there's the consideration for you know, security and privacy issues or complexity for users when selecting ticketing technologies. These are really important, and authorities have to pay particular attention to like managing sensitive data sets and also keeping consistent with the appropriate legal frameworks. I hope that answers it.
Great, thank you. And I think then also just to follow up for the question asker, we do have a dedicated work stream on digitalization, and we have several reports on the operationalization of multimodal platforms in terms of recommendations around data architecture, and indeed sharing principles are in there as well. So the difference between reporting, the aggregated information that goes back to the authority, and then the functional information that actually needs to be at a user level in order for and an operator level in order for the system to function. So I would certainly refer you on to those reports as well, which come from our digital innovation team. But we will keep, I'm conscious that we are running out of time and there are several more questions, so we will keep to the public transport fares focus for today. Angela or Hilia, did you have anything further you wanted to comment from a UITP's perspective in terms of interoperability and data use?
No, not on that topic, which is that does not fall into the content of our work. Other working groups, very much like ITF, work on that.
Great, thank you. So we have another question on data here, but it's more specifically in terms of what you need in order to be able to inform your fare policy. So I think maybe both presentations mentioned it. And so the question is around what is the minimum data needed and the minimum level of analysis in order to identify that point for affordability from the user perspective, from the government perspective, and from the operator's perspective in terms of covering costs, but offering still an attractive level of service. Josephine, sorry, Angela, would you like to come in, please?
Yep, I could start with that. I recognize that I guess different city and jurisdiction will probably have different maturity level in terms of the amount of data they have. But very minimally, I think you could look at what we do here is very minimally, basically most authority, I guess you conduct surveys, and then qualitatively you could run focus group discussions. And day in, day out, I would assume most of the authorities or operators would receive public feedback, which we do look at it, and there will be appeals coming in to say that, can you offer discounted fares for this group, that group, and whatnot. The other way to get data is like if you don't have it, we work quite closely with other agencies as well, whether with the Department of Statistics, whether with the Manpower, Ministry of Manpower, whether with Ministry of Education. These are places that you will be able to get data on the quantity, or who are the lower wage worker, or who are the students that would need help. And that would kind of give you the numbers that you need to kind of estimate the revenue impact if you were to introduce a certain discount schemes. And obviously there are also the public private side where that you can, maybe foundations, unions, that you can get some of these numbers as well. So that's my very short answer to that questions. And of course, if you have a high number of people using e-payment and e-cards for travel, then the data will get a lot more richer. Yeah, so thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Josephine, do you want to come in on that point?
No, not really much to add. Just I think really an understanding on what constitutes affordability within your context is super important, and as it was touched on in the UITP presentation.
Super, thank you. So maybe I could come back to you, Angela. Just we have spoken, obviously, it's kind of, you know, the well-known phrase that fare revenues are reducing, they don't cover costs. But in terms of looking at the different fare streams, or sorry, revenue streams that are available for optimization, how do we see the balance between fares and indirect contributions in terms of funding transport systems?
I think there's increasingly more and more recognition, especially I think since COVID, that fare revenue alone is quite challenging to be able to cover the cost, especially if the expectation of the passenger or the commuters are that they want better quality service. We need to make sure the infrastructure is barrier-free. We want good frequency, high reliability. We want the coverage to be widened. It is important to then say, you know, there is a cost to it and who will pay for it. And I think in both the report, we recognize there is a benefit to public transport that is beyond the direct user of it. So there are indirect users that should also contribute to this, because then it makes the road smoother and then the car user will be able to drive better. There is a benefit of taking all this more active mode of travel, more sustainable, better air. And then when you're building infrastructure near to commercial offices, these places also benefits from it as well. So I think there are different sources that different cities are exploring. It's quite interesting. We didn't touch on it as much, but I think in London or in different developing cities, they're looking at public-private contributions to the development of some of the public transport infrastructure, other than tax that you can look at. User charge, road usage charge is quite common in some of the cities. I think I want to go back on other than the contribution of fare and non-fare. There are some cities are looking into real estate as well, commercials, naming rights and stuff like that. But again, I wanted to repeat what Josephine had said. I think when we look at all this, you don't just look at the demand side, you look to look at the supply side. What are you offering to the passenger? And when we look at fares and sustainability public transport, I like to talk about the push and pull factor. While we try to pull people with maybe a sensible, simple, affordable fare, the overall strategy of pushing people away from car, whether it's through your parking strategies or through your road user charge, is important as well. All these puzzles needs to be in place in order to increase the public transport mode share. And when the ridership goes up, your fare revenue goes up as well. So you don't really need to increase it as much if I have more people using it, provided that my supply can support the demand. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Josephine, do you want to come in on that?
I think that
Further
was
to
very
add?
well put. Thanks.
I think that pretty much covered anything we would have said on it as well.
Yeah.
So I see a few questions with regard to the specifics of forms of passes or not in different countries. But the one of the a particularly interesting sort of intersectional question that has come in, I guess, is around the risk of induced demand. And so this is something, where there is that risk that you make something more affordable and accessible, but that results in an increase in the amount of travel that happens, particularly in countries that maybe have not renewed their fleet, particularly by the time that they introduce these policies. Is there a way for us to address this risk of induced demand while also recognizing that where it was latent demand amongst those on underserved or in underserved communities, there is a balance to be struck here when considering the accessibility view? But are there things that we should be taking into account considering this when we design our fare policies? And maybe, Josephine, I'll start with you. You make the point about optimizing fares in the context of road pricing as well to make sure that the modes chosen are the most sustainable possible. You've also done wider work on the accessibility front as well. So maybe you could comment a little bit about this on that sort of climate aspect of the work.
Right. I think what I would definitely say is we need to maybe not focus too much on the concept of induced demand, and also think about the question of whether we're actually unlocking latent demand. Are these people that were not able to access the public transport system before that are now able to access it, have opportunities to be more productive economically, or to access basic needs? Is that also being conflated with the question of induced demand? I think that is something to consider. But then I would also then say that in some cases, yes, there will be more people taking more short trips, but in the context of I guess, thinking about public transport's role in the future for decarbonizing urban mobility, if there are options for people to take that are beyond just public transport, that are linked to public transport, then people are more likely to take them. And if you make it easier for them to choose, say, cycling for part of their trip, or a bike share for a short segment of a trip that they would have taken a metro for 2 stops, then maybe you can also address it this way. So having these kinds of considerations for how the public transport system complements the overall the overall mobility system can make an impact on addressing this challenge of dealing with induced demands, especially for the short segments in places that have many, many options.
Yes, thank you. And of course, this also links to wider policy areas as well, in terms of taking a view more of access to opportunity rather than mobility. So, it's not more mobility is not necessarily good if it's because people have to travel further to access basic needs. So I'm conscious of time. We still have questions coming in. So thank you to everybody who has stuck with us for the full hour. This is probably most people's lunch break as well. Or dinner perhaps. So we really appreciate it. Angela, I'm going to give you an opportunity to come in there if you have any last remarks before we close and we can finish up on time.
No, I just want to say a big thank you to everybody for the joint webinar. I was quite heartened to have so many people that was interested in the topic, because when we started, I thought it was a rather lonely journey. I think I didn't think a few years back anybody was interested in fare affordability. So I'm really quite happy about this, and I hope the community will continue to grow and stay connected, and we could exchange best practices and lesson learned to make sure that we can promote public transport and make sure that it's financially sustainable as well. So thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to share the findings from the UITP Transport Economic and Finance Committee. So yeah, thank you.
And from us, thank you very much as well. I think the two pieces of work really complement each other. I think, this is one of those things that you can't actually approach it from only one angle. In order to have successful policies, it needs to be considered in the round, both from the aspects of everybody that it will affect, or the people making the decisions as well. So it's been very valuable for us to be able to look at these two pieces together, and indeed to identify that even though the work was carried out separately, they came came to much the same conclusions, which I think is very interesting to note institutionally, and also so that the participants are aware. Sorry, I saw you unmute yourself if you wish to come in again. No, that's fine. Okay, we are unfortunately out of time. There are several questions that I didn't manage to get to. I tried to group them as much as I could, but if you feel your question wasn't addressed, or if you have specific, you're looking for a specific case study that was referenced, again, the links to the report for Fairs Fair and to keep registered for the forthcoming policy brief, Keeping It Fair, should still be on your screen. Please do register for the publication updates with UITP in order to get that when it comes out. I certainly shall be straight after the webinar, and also keep in touch with both organisations in our ongoing work on this topic. I think it promises to be very interesting. We certainly haven't covered everything that needs to be covered on this topic, so we would also welcome your inputs on, as Angela said, lessons learned or case studies of successes that could translate into more generalisable knowledge. So with that, we're 2 minutes over, so I am going to close. Thank you all very much, and I wish you a lovely afternoon and evening. Goodbye.